Hello everyone and welcome back to day 9 and session number 21 of the AMBA and BGA Business School Leaders Forum, brought to you by GoToWebinar by LogMeIn. For those of you that don't know me, I'm David Woods-Hale, Director of Marketing and Communications at AMBA and BGA, and I'm delighted to be joined by Angus Lang, Dean of Lancaster University Management School, who's about to tackle the challenge of the future of business schools with us. If you haven't joined one of these sessions before, just to let you know, you can ask questions and put forward comments. Just pop them in the little box in your control panel, and I'll try and get through as many as I can towards the end of the session. Please also feel free to share your thoughts on the social media channel of your choice using the hashtag BSLF. I think I've spoken for long enough, and I'm particularly excited about this session. So to take us through the next part of the session, I will now pass over to Angus. Thank you.
David, thank you very much, and it does feel interesting to be number 21 in a series of events, and I've participated in a number of them and certainly found them valuable. I hope everyone who's participating will find this one valuable. I, in a sense, want to start off almost by begging a degree of forgiveness from you all, but I want to try and take you on a slightly idiosyncratic view, a personal reflection on business schools and the future possibilities for the development of that world in which we live. By way of context, I've had the privilege of observing business schools in many different contexts, in different markets, through accreditation panels, through internal reviews, in a sense, almost to be something of a voyeur looking at business schools. And as Dean, as many of you will experience, I've also had the opportunity to experiment on a living, breathing, and indeed most of the time sentient business school. So I'm going to take you on a voyage to the future by looking back at the past with unequivocal apologies to Charles Darwin for guiding us on that voyage. But I want to reflect back on a couple of other intellectuals before we get there. And I want us to start off just by noting two intellectual heavyweights, Luther and Galileo. Luther was a professor of theology. Galileo was the father of observational astronomy. If you look at what they did, Luther very much directly challenged the dogma of the church through questioning its practices, questioning the underlying ideology. Galileo, by contrast, more indirectly challenged the dogma of the church through his observations of the astronomical world. If you hold those two perspectives in your head for a second and try and fast forward and zoom literally into the current and far more important world of business schools, I think if we look back at what we've been doing in recent years, is there's been extensive questioning of our practices. Mintzberg, Pfeffer, Thomas, Parker, amongst many others, have questioned what we do. They've asked questions about that dominant dogma of business schools, the theory-practice debate, the orientation and operation of business schools, their relationships with the business community. They're the substance of most of those perspectives. I think it's fair to say probably that rather less attention has been paid, and that's sort of, if you like, the Luther perspective. I think rather less attention has been paid to actual observation of our little world, its astronomy, its ecosystems. And really what I want to try and do in this, as I said, idiosyncratic personal view, is to get out our telescopes, get out our microscopes, and have a look at the islands and the neighboring archipelagos of business schools, to see what insights they might offer to us. So I'm inviting you, if you like, to embark on the Beagle, Darwin's ship, and go on a series of voyages with me, and then try and, as Darwin did, distill lessons from those voyages. So the first place I'm going to go is to the business school archipelago. Let's go and explore our own lands. Let's think about our own lands. And if we're perfectly honest, I think the ecosystem of business schools is really quite boring. When you visit a business school, I often feel it's a little bit like watching a play that you know, say Macbeth. You know the plot line, you know the ending, you know what happens. And the variation really is confined to the idiosyncrasies of the director, the theatre, the actors, the audience themselves. For the rest, the plot line remains the same. And I think in this regard, 2 points stand out for me. If you look at the left-hand diagram, the picture, sorry, we all feed in the same market. We browse at the same height. Some will, yes, unequivocally, stretch a little more than others. But with the exceptions of some more exotic species like giraffe, we fundamentally compete for the same food, the same morsels. Now try and imagine, if you will, an image of the African bush. If all animals browsed at the same height, what would you end up with? You'd end up with denuded bushes and famished antelope. But the reality is very different. You've got impala, you've got kudu, you've got exotics like giraffe, all eating at different heights, a sustainable environment. And then secondly, the second image, we tend to duplicate. We copy each other, which in one level is not entirely surprising, given that we tend to browse in the same markets. Think of the theory of practice. Consumer expectations drive us, as they drive many other organizations, to degrees of isomorphic behavior. I would suggest that we are particularly prone to isomorphic behavior in the business school archipelago. If you want, just look at our programs, the extent to which our programs replicate each other in terms of the range of programs, in terms of the content. You can make the same observation about our modules. Take finance, operations management modules at an MBA level in institutions of your choice: Lancaster, Manchester, Indian School of Business, Rotterdam School of Management, etc., etc. There's an awful lot of similarity. Look at our quality assurance processes. There's an awful lot of similarity. We focus on the same things. We focus on the same dimensions of quality. Yet the irony is we operate, to all intents and purposes, as a craft, a cottage industry model. We're doing the same things, but because we're doing them all separately, there are very significant cost, efficiency, and scalability questions. So I'll leave those thoughts with you about the business school archipelago. And so, reboarding the Beagle, if you like, let's go and look at some other archipelagos to try and see what lessons we can learn. So my second voyage is going to take us to 2 commercial islands. And these are rather different islands, retailing and fast food. So if you look at them, the observer, you, coming off your ship, are going to be struck firstly by the diversity of provision, and secondly, by the dominance of large organizations. And in both settings, the ecosystem is arguably characterized by multiple shapes of actors, all of whom look very different. Small independent shops or fast food outlets, franchises, large multiples, chains, so very different range of organizational forms. There'll be in both cases, there'll be a wide range of foci in terms of retail, for example, food, clothing, DIY. They're all rather different. Or alternatively, in fast food, burger, kebab, pizza. Sorry, I'm showing the sophistication of the Scottish diet. And what you've also got is a wide variety of quality, a wide variety of price in this ecosystem. But I think it's also worthwhile noting, in fact, it's absolutely central to note, that significant new entrants periodically radically disrupt the market. So you could look to Carrefour or Tesco in the 1970s, Amazon in the 2000s. But throughout all of this, the dominant shift in the ecosystem would be towards the dominance of a shrinking number of large players. Well, you could legitimately, very legitimately, make the observation that the seas, the climate around these islands are very different from those around the business school archipelago. They are less regulated. The products are less complex. And because of that, a very different ecosystem has evolved to that which we see within the business school archipelago. But let's just go somewhere else quickly. Let's get back on the ship and go to, on a third voyage, to another set of islands. And I'll offer you utilities. Now, I apologize here that we're very Anglo-Saxon, very British in our orientation here in these companies. But I'm just going to offer you a couple of useful observations, I think useful in terms of our thinking around business schools. So in visiting these utility islands, we also need to do a little bit of archaeological work. We need to dig into the past to understand where the islands are today. So if you think about utilities, transport, public transport, and electricity, these islands do, in many ways, feel more like the islands that we encountered in the business school archipelago. It's a highly regulated market environment. There's a very strong public good dimension as well. So they may be more similar, but the seas, the climate around these islands has changed dramatically. Is it warmer? Is it more acidic in recent years? So what might that represent? The regulatory regime has certainly changed dramatically. The wider political environment has changed, with competition as a virtue to improve efficiency and service. So let's go back to that archaeological dimension. The bus in the top left-hand corner belonged to Grampian Regional Transport, a publicly owned small bus operator in Aberdeen in the northeast of Scotland. That has over the years morphed into the First Group, which runs buses and rail services, not just in the UK, but internationally. Very, very different company, but tracing its roots a way back. If we look then at what is now Scottish and Southern Electricity, this used to be the South of Scotland Electricity Board. So and it has moved from being a publicly owned national body to being a profit-oriented global body. You've seen a shift in terms of emphasis from sort of public service to really assertive competitive branding. So the established status quo, if you like, has been transformed in 2 decades. And some organizations within both markets, within public transport, within electricity generation, some organizations, some species have evolved, others were lost. They were swallowed up or they failed. And the lesson I want to take from this is an archipelago that's more akin to the business school world. So we cannot assume the status quo, not for the medium to longer term. And we need to think about drawing lessons from how those archipelagos that we've looked at, retail, fast food, utility, have changed, particularly the latter. So as Charles Darwin did, let's sail the Beagle home, let's go and reflect, let's go and try and think what some of the lessons might be. Go back to the rectory that Darwin lived in, or in our case, let's go back to our deanery and ask the question, so what might we make? What might we distill from these various observations? The first one, and we all know this intuitively, but how often do we apply it to business schools, is that ecosystems are dynamic. Species undergo change. The mix of species changes. Some species become extinct. And very often, it's external factors impacting on the ecosystem that drives this dramatic change. But equally, the species themselves can drive change. And let's ask a question. The ultimate change in an ecosystem is about extinction. How do extinctions happen? So if we take the dinosaurs, it was the literal impact of massive environmental change, or at least so we currently surmise. In the case of the unfortunate dodo, that was the impact of a super predator, a super competitor. So if we go and flip back to the business school archipelago, the business school ecosystem, what environmental changes, what super predators might we be forced to confront? And it's worrying during the working day, but in the small hours of the night, arguably, it can assume nightmarish qualities, nightmarish proportions. So what is the nightmare? And you can probably guess the bad jokes, the bad puns that are following now. So what is the nightmare on Bean Street? What are the real issues that are keeping us awake, are really concerning us? And I think it's clear that we confront both massive environmental impact and potential super predators on us. So if we think about the environmental impact, it's dramatic, it's sudden, but in many ways, it's the long-term impact that is the real killer, the real driver of change. So think about technology. And if I can flick back to Luther, think about the printing press and the church, the ultimate disintermediation of the relationship between man and God. Think about regulatory change, informational empowerment and competition. That's been a key driver, an absolutely central driver at the core of UK policy on regulation. Think about the rise of think about social change, the rise of the sharing economy, the amateur professional. So the likes of Uber, Airbnb, changing the world. And lastly, let's not forget those radical changes, those radical disruptions that can come in and change in a blink of an eye how we operate. A coronavirus is the most obvious example, an example that we're all acutely sensitive of. And some instances linked to such environmental change, wider geopolitical rivalry. So there's a whole set of factors that are changing, are distorting, disturbing the environment within which we operate. But if that weren't enough, those environmental impacts, we've also got to recognize the super predators that confront us. They're coming into our lands. They're bringing new values. They're bringing new resources. Just think about the poor old dodo and the sailor with his gun. So what might some of these super predators be? We recognize many of them already. We've got the publishers capitalizing on their intellectual content and systems, capitalizing on their reach, their scale, their economies. We've also got private equity We recognize there's growing demand globally for university education, for business education, and we are vulnerable, comparatively under-resourced compared to these organizations. And it's not only organizations, private equity, publishers, it's consulting companies. Take McKinsey and Company as an example, who are increasingly operating in the same space as at least part of what business schools do. They are coming into some of the, if you like, outer islands of our archipelago. Just yesterday, I had a virtual meeting by advisory board, and one member of the advisory board, Paul Taylor, is chief exec of the Fitch Group, and he was talking about Fitch Learning. It only makes up 2% of their total business, around about £50 million turnover. They're quite comfortable coping with the disruption caused by the COVID virus because they have got very, very deep pockets. They can afford to support Fitch Learning for the medium term. It's supported by the rest of the organization. They can focus on continuing to invest, continuing to develop for the longer term. Contrast that with many of us who are the financial drivers of our institutions which lack the same financial clout and the pressure that's putting on us. So these super predators, whatever their form, the one thing we can be sure of is they tend to have better, stronger financial resources than we do. So a combination of environmental impact, encompassing social change, regulatory change, technological change, all together fundamentally raise the question of whether extinction looms for business schools. And I'd say, probably to be expected, not necessarily. But what's probably less expected is, I would say, let's think about ducks. Now, I think if we're all perfectly honest, we're not really talking about particularly heroic creatures here. They're not in the eagle territory, the eagle league. You don't really see a duck on a coat of arms. I suppose the nearest would be an emu, so my apologies to any Australians at present. But heroes often end up dead. And so though while ducks are not necessarily heroic, we cannot deny that they are successful. Fundamentally, beyond Antarctica, find anywhere without a duck and you're doing rather well. So I think that should probably encourage us to ask the question, why are they successful? What is it about them that has made them so successful? I'd argue, as Darwin would, it's because of the way they have evolved. Specifically, they have proven to be highly, highly adaptable. And let's just think about sort of 4 dimensions to this. First of all, there are many, many breeds living in a variety of environments which are able to compete for space, resources, food with other species in that particular environment. But nevertheless, they are all unequivocally ducks. Secondly, they're absolutely at home in the air, on water, on land. They're adaptable. They can cope with different terrain. They can live, they can thrive in different contexts. Thirdly, they can thrive as individuals, as pairs, or as a flock. So they can work together, but they can live, operate independently. And they are remarkably good at cooperating with a super predator. So, having observed briefly ducks, and without really, I apologize for this, ducking the issue, what can we learn that is of relevance for business schools? I think at the headline level, and then we'll start digging into this in a bit more depth, is that it's the adaptability to the environment. It's the ability to cope with environmental change, environmental shocks. So how do we try and ensure that we're ducks, not dodos? And what are some of the key characteristics of the environment facing business schools? So alongside the potentially very dramatic impacts of environmental change, so go back, technology, regulation, social change, pandemics, geopolitical challenges, it's possible to see, I think, 3 dimensions of the ecosystem that are going to be central to the future of business schools, however those dramatic interventions, those dramatic impacts actually play out. And the first one is the global demand for university education. There is unequivocally massive latent demand in developing economies. If there wasn't, you wouldn't see private equity and a range of private investors rushing into the development of universities, the development of private business schools in large parts, large swathes of the developing economy. There is unequivocally limited existing capacity in many developing economies. And it's not just financial capacity, it's the people, it's the systems in developing economies. One of the things you unequivocally recognize when going around on accreditation visits in business schools in developing economies is the challenges often of being able to secure the academic staff and the professional service colleagues with the expertise required to deliver high quality university education. Secondly, there are very considerable financial pressures on the sector, financial pressures on government. In many economies, developed and less developed, there is limited financial resources able to be devoted to university education. You want to put money into health, primary and secondary education long before you consider tertiary education. That's then created a very significant space for the private provision, for bringing in players who may operate in a more commercial manner than that which you'd see from many of the public service incumbent players. So financial pressures. And thirdly is consumer choice and consumption. There is, in most developing economies, a pervasive culture of choice. You might view it as the tyranny of consumerist culture. But given the financial pressures on governments, the move to a focus on the user paying for their education is inextricably linked to the development of the business school and university world and how we operate with that more consumer-facing model. So the implication I would read from this is firstly the need for scale of provision to service that latent demand, particularly in the developing economies. Secondly, because of the financial pressures, because of users paying, the need for cost-effective provision. And thirdly, because of consumer choice, and if one is being perhaps more positive, the divergent needs that exist amongst different consumers, there is a need for a range of formats to meet demand. I'd refer you back then to the commercial archipelago of retailing and fast food in terms of thinking about these and thinking about a trajectory of evolution for business schools. So where might that leave us? And what might a brave new world for business schools actually look like? This is where I want us to be able to begin a bit of a conversation. So drawing to a close to create an opportunity for us to have conversations, because I don't pretend in any shape or form to have the answers here. I think I've got a lot of the questions. I've got views unequivocally, but I value the opportunity for a wider conversation around what we think the brave new world for business schools will be. But as I've got the screen, I've got the privilege of putting my pitch in first. I think the first element that we've got to realize is the need for diversity of provision. There are varying demands. There are very different consumer expectations. We have consumers who expect choice. So how do we position ourselves differently? How do we ensure that, if I refer back to that very first voyage to our own business school world, we're not all eating at the same height in the African bush? So what we really require as a business school community is a diverse ecosystem, a range of less isomorphic institutions delivering less isomorphic programs and research. We need institutions, we need organizations that are capable of reaching very, very different markets. And the fundamental question here arises, how do we reach those different markets? It's not just that we are different, that we have got different value propositions, which I'll come on to shortly, but we're going to ask the question, how do we reach those markets? We tend not to think, at least not formally, when looking at business schools, about distribution channels. But the route to market for business schools is, I think, going to become an increasingly critical issue. In some ways, it's about how we make our product available, but it's also about how we work with a wide range of partners. How do we, as those ducks do, potentially collaborate with super predators and manage to survive? We also need to, in terms of that diverse ecosystem, serve very, very different needs. The needs of individual students, the needs of companies, the needs of communities. How do we, the question I've gotten, it concerns me a lot given where I currently work, the school I currently lead. What is the future for that full service business school? Is there a future for that full service business school? Or is it much more going to be around serving particular markets, narrower organizations, more specialist organizations? I suspect you can make an argument either way, but it's about serving different needs. I'm not terribly much aware of situations where business schools operate under more than one brand to serve different markets. But if you look in many parts of the commercial world, you will find same organization, underlying organization, using different brands to serve different markets, to serve different needs. And thirdly, in that diverse ecosystem, it's about delivering different value propositions. And I think the starting point here is we need to be much clearer about defining what we do. What is our underlying value proposition? And we probably need to go back and ask some fairly profound strategic questions around what our underlying assets are. What is it that enables us as business schools to deliver value? I would offer the suggestion that at the very core of what we do is developing academic excellence, developing excellence in pedagogy, developing excellence in disciplinary research. And we tend to be fairly good at that. But we have tended to be rather inwardly focused. We've not necessarily thought enough of the value propositions that we deliver to our clients. And in doing that, we've also, I would suggest, been guilty of prioritizing form over function and say, we deliver bachelor's education, we deliver master's education, rather than asking a question about how we actually leverage that academic excellence? How can we create new products, new ways of delivering a value proposition to a particular market that draws on our disciplinary research excellence and our excellence in pedagogy? So going back and asking, what are the key assets, what are the underlying resources of a business school? All of this suggests we've got to question, we've got to challenge our isomorphic behaviours. And central to that, I would contend, is challenging the impact of rankings. Rankings, as we all recognise, very often almost invariably, created with the best of intent, provide the consumers with information reflecting that consumerist market in which we operate. But before we get into a debate about whether what rankings measure is right or not, I think we need to acknowledge that as schools seek to play the rankings game, and so far as the rankings game is important in attracting students, it does drive us too often to do the same things. So we've got to challenge, we've got to question the role of rankings in the business school world. I think we also need to, coming to the middle, the individual, the business, the society level, ask questions about what is the role of the business school. Is it about simply about educating students? Is it about providing cutting-edge knowledge development programs for companies? Is it about providing talent for companies? What is it? What is our role in society? Is it about fostering new businesses? Is it around supporting economic growth? I think we need to be looking forward to a post-COVID world here and talking about, yes, our role is about creating, supporting sustainable businesses. It's about promoting, it's about supporting sustainable work for our populations. It's about creating communities that are sustainable environmentally and sustainable socially. This, I would suggest, also encourages us to think a little bit more broadly about the content of business schools, about the boundaries of business schools. Where do we draw the boundaries of business schools? I think one of the healthiest things that business schools have done has been to support the development, evolution of new disciplinary areas. Take, for example, information systems. We almost, if you like, could argue that business schools rescued an area of activity, an area of endeavour, an area of knowledge from computing science in creating and developing, seeing the evolution of information systems. So we have a role, I think, in terms of being a translator, taking knowledge, expertise developed in other areas, and then looking at how we can use that knowledge, engage that knowledge with practice, engage that knowledge with the world in a different way. So I think we have a role in terms of thinking about translating what happens in much of academia into the worlds of practice. If you went back to the 14th and 15th century, religious bodies, religious organizations would have been at the very core of society and amongst the most influential bodies in the land, in any country. It's now business. So we have a role to play to bring other disciplinary areas into engagement with business, to not only create sustainable businesses, but perhaps more importantly, create sustainable work and sustainable communities. But if we're going to do that for business schools, what really matters is about, and I think what I hope I've been able to communicate is, it's about delivering long-term value. And I particularly chose that icon image on the top right because it's got the word worth, it's got the word fair, it's got the words being useful, because these are the things that business schools must do. And we've got to understand, we've got to become much better at defining what our value is, what our value is to different communities. It's also about efficiency. I think we've got to ask the question is whether our model of delivery today is efficient for the world, is appropriate, sorry, is suitable for the world we face in the future. We've built our model on a system of wider academia that traces its roots back to a period when at best 10% of the population went into tertiary education. It's a very, very different world we're operating in now. Are we, in all honesty, as efficient as we could be? I think if we're honest with ourselves, no, because we're working not merely with legacy systems, but a legacy mindset about the shape of academic organizations. And lastly, it's about diversity. It's about sustainability of ourselves. Can we bring the right mix of players together in our communities to propagate and then disseminate knowledge effectively? And these are things that we always teach our students. It's our bread and butter, if you like. But I think one of the interesting elements is the extent to which we adequately apply these to ourselves and look at ourselves through the lenses that we use to explain the world, the business world, a range of archipelagos to our students. So I'm fundamentally optimistic about the future of business schools. I think the future is bright, but only if we observe ourselves very carefully, constantly ask questions about how we operate and learn from that observation and then act. And it is in many ways, it's that last element that really, really matters, the ability to act. I can't remember which European politician it was, made an observation that we all know what needs to be done, but if we said what needs to be done, we wouldn't win the next election. And I think that's some of the issues we face in academia, in business schools. We tend to operate in a very collegiate environment. We as business school leaders probably have a reasonable sense of what the answers are. I would hope little of what I've introduced today is new. The way of packaging it, I hope, will be new. But we should know many of the issues that we confront. But it's all very well to observe and learn, but it only matters if we act, if we can bring our respective business school communities, our staff base with us. And that, I think, is the challenge we really face if we're going to become ducks rather than dodos. So thank you for joining me on this voyage. I look forward to a conversation. So thank you very much.
Hi, Angus. Thank you very much for an outstanding presentation. Lots to consider there, and certainly very challenging. I think in the same vein, you've had a lot of challenging questions that have come through for you. So we've got some time to go through those. The first question that I've got here is around considering business schools as a homogenous group, and that's something that we often talk about when describing this community. But somebody's asking, if we didn't consider business schools as a homogenous group, but as organizations in their own right, in what areas should business schools be collaborating with each other, and in what areas should they be competing?
That's an extremely good question, and I think my answer would be where we choose to compete and where we choose to collaborate must depend on the individual business schools. So do we collaborate in areas where two schools, let's take two schools, might want to collaborate in a particular area because neither have sufficient resources in their own right to operate effectively, to compete effectively in that particular area. So there could well be sense in combining resources, combining expertise to enable us to collaborate. I think there's some interesting observation can be drawn from different contexts. So if I go back a number of years when I worked at the University of Glasgow, in the Scottish university sector, there was a real push for collaboration to reduce costs. And you saw really successful collaboration in areas like physics and areas like chemistry, where there were big, high fixed costs and you could actually reduce, there was a real interest in sharing core resources. Efforts, by contrast, to push collaboration in areas where there were lower costs and the revenue streams were more important to universities, collaboration was a lot less easy. So business schools, economics, securing collaboration was a lot more difficult than it had been in physics and chemistry. So I think the issue for me comes in terms of one pursues collaboration when you can achieve more collectively than you could achieve individually. And competition is enhanced in areas where it is critical to your current revenue stream. I'm not sure if that answers the question.
No, it absolutely does. Absolutely does. Thank you very much. Another question has come through around lifelong learning. That's obviously something that's a key strategic imperative for business schools at the moment. And they're sort of asking, there's been a lot of conversation around Uberization of other sectors. So Uberization of HR, Uberization of retail, perhaps. They're sort of asking if it's time that business schools really got on board with that Uberization agenda, looked more at nano courses, stackable courses, focusing perhaps on graduates and alumni as opposed to students in the more traditional recruitment channels that they use?
Yeah, whoever's put the question is clearly reading my mind in terms of lots of things we're looking at doing at the moment. Some people might have seen there's a piece in Times Higher Education, I think it was this week, talking about moves in Australia, supported by the Australian government around micro-credentialing. I think we've got to ask real questions around what is the product we offer, at least to certain markets. And this would come back to the point I was making right at the end. How do we leverage our academic excellence? I think there will continue to be a place for the conventional undergraduate, the conventional full-time face-to-face master's program. I have little doubt about that. I think, however, there is hugely growing demand from what we might consider less traditional markets, people who are wanting and needing to continually upskill, to continually learn through their careers. And I think we have become overly focused on a particular form of leveraging our academic excellence, i.e. that full-time face-to-face undergraduate, postgraduate programs, and we've invested in infrastructure to support that. I'd contend we've probably not invested enough in infrastructure around our ability to deliver more flexible learning for a longer period. And I think if I was looking at it, I'd be saying, well, we've got to think about learning being for life, and potentially when a student is signing up to a business school, yeah, they're paying an upfront fee, but we almost need to think about that upfront fee, at least in part, being a subscription. In other words, you get what you're paying for up front, but that gives you access to ongoing learning and development opportunities. Albeit a limited amount. If you want more than that, you then top it up. But it is about lifelong learning. So I think we've got to focus on developing the resources, the capability to service this rather different market. And that ranges everything. And that brings us typically into challenging, as business schools almost always end up doing, challenging wider university norms, wider university systems. So is your student information system fit for running these small bite-size modules, for accumulating credits? There'll be plenty of institutions where that's not the case. So you have to look at building them. And it takes, I think, the margins in these will also be an awful lot lower than you would typically see in many of our conventional products. So if you're going to do them, you have to do them at scale. So the investment in the distribution capacity matters. I think the danger is assuming we can adopt some of these quite easily, quite quickly. We do need to adopt them quickly, but I think we must recognize it's not always easy to move in that direction. And we certainly shouldn't jettison that which we are good at if we are still retaining a competitive position in that marketplace.
Absolutely, thank you. Somebody else has asked around your comment about the sort of goals and values of the business schools. They're asking if the business school community as a whole has remained too silent on the climate emergency?
Yeah, I think I suspect we'll probably get a lot of consensus here, which begs the question of why have we perhaps not been more active. I think we'd all feel that it possibly has not been active enough in addressing, and I would talk about sustainability, resilience in the round. It's environmental, but it's also societal. I think we've been too comfortable dealing with the more almost, if you like, micro issues, how things operate, rather than asking questions necessarily about why things operate in particular ways. There's almost a sense, I think, that some of these big issues, these macro issues, we've almost ceded the terrain to other disciplines. We've focused, and in some ways, I could make some fairly trenchant criticism of our approach to publishing and the way in which we venerate particular types of research that is around fairly narrow disciplinarily focused research, rather than the big interdisciplinary research that addresses many of these questions. So to cut a long story short, despite the best efforts of PRME and a variety of other organizations and initiatives, I think we haven't wrestled with the big issues of the place of business in the environment, business in society.
Thank you. Yeah. And then something else is asking around disruption. And you use the term evolution. You talked about the evolution of business schools, and people are sort of saying, well, is revolution a better word? Is it time that we were more revolutionary in how we consider, moving forward in the new world? So, sorry, potentially taking ideas from our students or learning from them as opposed to teaching them. Is that how we can disrupt the disruptors, as it were?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm never quite sure that there's a real distinction. I think it's more of a spectrum between moving from evolution to revolution. When does very rapid evolution actually become a revolution? So I think there's a continuum of change. What I'd say is I don't think we are changing fast enough, and we do need to change faster. Academia likes to consider itself as progressive, but in many ways, behaviourally and organizationally, it is perhaps one of the most conservative sectors. So we've got to recognize that we have to manage a community forward to become more at the revolutionary end rather than the slow evolutionary end of that change continuum. I think it's a really good point about this, and it's vaguely linked to the sort of Uberization of what role do we have vis-a-vis our students in terms of providing knowledge as opposed to facilitating learning, and the role of peer-to-peer learning, the development, creating spaces for students themselves to develop. And I think we have historically over-venerated the inculcation of disciplinary knowledge, and most of us will be familiar with all the narratives around how business schools evolved in the particular way they did. And Howard Thomas's wonderful phraseology of physics envy, trying to copy a particular style of working that did unequivocally venerate the disciplinary research, rather than perhaps some of the more pedagogical focus that we potentially probably should have had, given the nature of what it is we do. We're an applied domain. I'm very, very strongly in favor of creating learning communities, creating learning networks that can develop. One of the couple of really good examples of things we do at Lancaster, our Entrepreneurs in Residence network. We've got in excess now, and we've run this scheme for more than a decade. We've got 60 entrepreneurs in residence. They commit to spending time coming into the classrooms, working with students on an ongoing basis. They commit 3 days a year to pro bono to doing this each individually. That's hugely valuable in terms of them bringing their experience. It's also hugely valuable in encouraging the students themselves to think about how they can learn from one another and fostering a sharing of experience, because many of our entrepreneurs in residence, well, quite a number of them, have come through a variety of programs we run, and one of our great strengths in, for example, SME development work has been around how we foster learning between organizations. So you put a group of SME owner managers together, we create the space for them to learn, and yes, we do provide expert knowledge in there, but the biggest element is allowing them to learn amongst themselves. So I think we do need to push further the active co-opting of our learners, whether they're undergrad, whether they're bachelor students or people in post-experience programs, to take an active part in the learning and recognize just how much we can learn from them, and hence how valuable it is to blur the boundaries between the outside and the inside of the business school in the learning experience.
Great stuff, thank you. I think we've got time for one more question, and it wouldn't be a 2020 event unless we mentioned COVID-19. Somebody's asking, they seem to be an optimist as well. They said in 2008, after the financial crisis, there was an increase in global MBA applications. Do you think that this is something that could happen again following this next crisis? And also, that there's another question that I think we could bring into this as well. Business schools were in crisis mode, you know, from the start of March, really, and now they're moving to think more strategically. So given that they have the opportunity to really move forward and thrive, you mentioned Martin Luther at the start of your presentation, could COVID-19 be the spark in the powder keg that business schools need?
I think very good questions, and I think we probably all, there's almost an element of isomorphism here, in that we're all I know from talking to fellow deans, we're responding in similar ways. But I do actually think this will be the element that drives us to operate in new ways. Many of the things that we've needed to operate in new ways have existed for a long time. I think two things have arisen. One is that much of the technology and the behaviours associated with the technology have come to permeate throughout society, so they're normal. We're not pushing uphill. We would be going with the grain if we moved in a, for example, more digital direction. The second element is it has brought into what are, as I've said already, I think anyway, are conservative organisations an awareness of a need to change, and I think we will change. I think I'm optimistic about the role that business schools play. I do actually, I know it sounds a bit odd, believe in business schools, believe in what they do, that we do have real value, we do have real purpose, but we've got to make sure that we articulate to our internal colleagues as well as our external partners what that value really is. So I think the move to more blended approaches, the previous question I was asking around thinking around stackable, micro-credentialing, all of those sorts of elements, I think we will come out of this looking different. We've got to retain our core values, our core assets, sorry, which is developing and leveraging academic excellence and making sure we use that in manners that fit the forthcoming environment. So I think we will adapt, I think we will evolve. I don't think it will be the meteor affecting the dinosaurs or the sailor killing the dodos. But I do think we've got to be very careful that if we don't act now, the cumulative effect of those, as well as the other environmental impacts, will wear us down and allow others to come into a space that we would consider our own.
Great stuff. Thank you very much, Angus. And thank you again for a fantastic presentation. Unfortunately, I think that's all we have time for in this particular session. Just to remind you all, later this afternoon at 3:30 p.m. BST, we will be investigating the future of higher education admissions with Tanya Roquette, Solutions Director at Full Fabric, and Oliver Matthews, Chief Marketing Officer at Frankfurt School of Finance and Management. Tomorrow at 2:30 p.m. BST, we'll be back with Nick Barneville, Associate Dean of Degree Programs at ESMT Berlin, and Lise Hammergren, Executive Vice President of BI Norwegian Business School, who will be discussing a strategy for building business school alliances. And the final session of this entire conference will take place tomorrow afternoon. That's Friday, the 26th of June at 3:30 p.m. BST, during which David Lefebvre, director of the EdTech Lab at Imperial College Business School and co-founder of Incendi, alongside Mark Wells, co-founder and chief product officer at Incendi, will share their expert insight on creating pedagogically powerful learning experiences. You can register for all these sessions using the links we've provided in the chat box. Just before we go, if you've missed any sessions, we've put the recordings of all those that have taken place on our website for you, and I've pasted a link in the chat room so you can find it and access the content. We will be making the attendee list for all the sessions available on our website. For security reasons, we've pasted the password and the delegate list, the password for the delegate list for this session in the chat box. And we also recommend that you follow the hashtag BSLF on social media to share your thoughts and see updates of the conference there. Thank you finally again to Agus for taking the time to speak to us today, for sharing your insight and your advice and some challenges as well to consider for the future. And I hope to see you all again at 3:30 for the next session. Thank you and goodbye.